So, Evan, you and I are speaking at a really special time right now, which is this, COVID-19. People are still in lockdown and everything like that. But actually, your life has very much been driven by the digital customer experience in the first place, not certainly by the coronavirus. But what I find most interesting is that your digital experience and your journey actually began somehow with a Canadian fishing story. Can you please just take the floor and make some sense of this?
Yeah, it's thank you. That's a good introduction. So my career has followed a very unusual trajectory. I started out working when I was about 12 years old, working on my father's fish boat during the summers. We are a fishing family, and on both sides of the family, we have experience on the water for generations. So growing up on the west coast of Canada in Vancouver, it was a real part of our lifestyle. And it was how, I paid for school initially, and I paid for early education and some, different business ideas and stuff was through this whole fishing experience. And it's a great primer for a business career, because it is, it's essentially a small business. My father owns his boat outright. He owns his license. He owns the house and the workshop and the storage facilities and the trucks, everything that goes with that business. And when I started working, even at age 12, I worked on a cruise ship, which he really instilled on me meant every extra minute that I spent, sharpening a hook or cleaning gear or something, just making the boat run more efficiently. The boat would catch more. I'd get more share of that catch. I'd make more money. And at a young age, to have that so obviously shown to you that if you work harder, you make more money, I think really sets you up for success in business. But I was thrown a bit of a curveball. In fact, all throughout my teens, I'd always assumed that I was going to be a fish boat captain too. I had various dreams about how I was going to do that, and maybe we would expand into a fleet, and my dad would be the admiral and all this stuff. But in '97, when I finished high school, that was the year that the Canadian government made a move to sort of regulate everything. And so the old area that my dad had been able to fish with one license was cut into thirds. It was made extremely restrictive. There were new restrictions brought in on the types of gear we could use and so on. So I felt that career path had just been taken away from me.
Mm-hmm.
So I went fishing for that summer after high school graduation. That was a year when I went farther afield than I ever had before. I worked in tuna fishing in pretty much the middle of the Pacific for 2 months. We'd be at sea for a month until the boat was full. Not on my dad's boat, but on another boat. And it was the first time that I traveled a little bit too, because we fished all down the West Coast, down to Oregon and Washington, Northern California. So I saw, a different country, although it was pretty similar. It's still North America. It actually felt like I was traveling. And I think that inspired me to want to keep traveling, to keep going and see more of the world. So I had this sort of business foundation. I kind of enjoyed like sales. When I first went into college, I had pursued a career in engineering, and then discovered that I was not so mathematically inclined. Calculus was a bit hard for me. But I kind of had the seed of this idea that, okay, well, maybe I'm not going to be able to build cool stuff myself, but maybe I can be one of these business side people that helps to promote it, to market it. Maybe I can be more like the business owner. So I shifted gears more into business management. And I studied marketing. And, this is like 2001, 2002. In Western Canada, I would say that the dot-com bubble burst a little later than it did in like Silicon Valley. So when I was working around, 2001, and so I was working in things like telecommunications, selling mobile phones and that sort of thing, part-time, and getting some insight into, this whole technology sphere. We had these first like Palm Pilots that then had these WAP-enabled browsers. You're probably too young to remember this, but it was a really cool thing when you could start sending these messages from your phone, SMS, and then you could go on the internet. And I think it was like around 99 or something, you could order a pizza online and that sort of thing for the first time. So that was kind of revolutionary. That was cool to be able to do this with your mobile phone. So I kind of took that whole experience of interest in business, wanting to see the world, having studied marketing, and I kind of had the seed of an idea that I could take all of these fish that my dad were catching and send to Japan. And it always was our primary market. You know, we'd always sold most of like our sockeye salmon and our various catch to Japan, until about 95, when the burst of the Japanese economic bubble really started to affect seafood sales in Canada. You know, when the Japanese yen was high, we would have a great Christmas. That was kind of
Yeah.
my, our family's sort of, you know, point of reference. So I thought, okay, well, I'm going to go to Japan. And I had, you know, both friendship and romantic reasons. I'd met somebody nice at college that I wanted to see again. So I went to Japan, and I first went to northern Japan, to Hokkaido, because Tomakomai and Vancouver are the two closest ports. There's actually a shipping route. They're the two closest ports between North America and Asia. So all the container ships come over from, you know, Vancouver to, first of all, Tomakomai in Hokkaido. So I live close to there, and I sort of researched the idea of more direct import routes, and then promoting Canadian seafood in Japan and marketing Canadian seafood. And I worked with Jetro. I think 2 or 3 podcasts ago, you had an
Daiki
interesting,
Nakajima, yeah.
yeah, Daiki, yeah. So he's was more focused on, I think, the New York office. So it's the other
Right.
side of what Jetro does, and the news sort of side of what Jetro does. But I worked with the, you know, the Hokkaido office, which was kind of these a little bit amakudari, the old boys, you know, obviously mentoring and sharing their experience, but their experience was very traditional. Let's put it that way. So they didn't really have much insight into how I could circumvent, you know, the legislation in place that was protecting like the local seafood industry, or how I could get into like the fishermen's unions and do the lobbying that I needed to do and this sort of thing. And I did not have the Japanese skills at that time to be able to do that myself. So that initial business idea didn't get much traction. But to pay the bills while I was doing that, being Canadian, I could come on a working holiday visa. So I taught English, as you do, during that first year. And I actually taught for the largest chain school at the time, Nova. And people who've been in Japan for a while will recognize that name as one that experienced some disruption and a change of ownership and management, which was probably necessary shortly after the time that I worked there. And we could all see this coming. All of the teachers who worked there and many of the students saw that there were clear pluses and minuses in their business model. So I took what I thought worked about that business model, and I started my own English school. And then I applied, you know, these concepts like building my own web page, and then creating basic, you know, emailing lists, and like a Twitter feed. And then when it opened up to businesses, which was a couple of years later, a Facebook page as well. So I used these sort of key components of digital marketing to promote my own school. And at that time, the school began to grow quite quickly. I had a lot of corporate students. You know, I was teaching large groups on site at corporations. And some of them started to ask, well, how come your school is growing so quickly? Like, how do you do all this promotion? Are you know, standing out on the corner handing out flyers like all the other schools? And
What's the only way, obviously, in 2005 in Japan?
yeah, I mean, it was what everybody else was doing. And I did go around and stuff mailboxes with flyers a couple of times, but pretty quickly I found that was just not a very effective method of marketing. But I did get some traction with the digital marketing, and I kind of honed my skills and basic stuff. Like I learned how to code a website, how to build, you know, basic HTML, CSS type websites and stuff. And this was just building partly off the foundation of what I'd learned in school. We were learning the rudimentary basics of coding and stuff at school back in, you know, the early 2000s, 99, I guess, 2000. And a lot of it was self-study. So, I will sort of highlight that as one tip that I'd really like to give to anybody who's interested in a career in digital marketing or even engineering in Japan right now. There still is not really a traditional career path. You know, even if you are a computer science graduate from a top-tier Japanese university right now, you're still getting a lot of the foundations of computing. You'll learn about, you know, C, and the whole history of these programming languages and stuff. But you may not graduate with the ability to walk right into a job and start building out applications. Certainly not, like SPAs and all of this, headless CMS and all of the sort of newer technology that supports the current true digital ecosystem. You're going to have to self-study, or you're going to have to go to some sort of online program, something like a Code Chrysalis or something like that. You're going to have to self-study. So if you can reinforce the discipline to always be listening to podcasts like this, to always be reading, to be going through tutorials online, you will enhance your skills enough that you can craft a career out of this, much like I did. And it is for sort of the adventurous who are willing to take on that sort of burden of self-study and quite a bit of self-responsibility in order to craft a career like this. But that's a bit of a digression. To circle back to the story. I had enough of these requests about how I was marketing the school and whether I could market these other companies online, that I realized there was actually a greater need for that than the school. And I was kind of burning out. I was teaching in the school, working in the business, not on the business.
Mm-hmm.
And it was hard. Like, I identified at one point that in order to expand the school, I needed more physical locations and more teachers, and I had to expand it into at least a tri-city chain. And so I went to, I forget the acronym for it, but the Japanese government essentially has its small business loan center where it guarantees very low interest loans that are almost free money. And I went to try and get approved for that. And this is when I'd been studying Japanese for, I think, 3 years. In my third year of kind of full immersion in Japan, having arrived with nothing. I couldn't speak Japanese when I arrived. But by the third year, I had self-studied and picked up enough Japanese that I could go through all of these loan applications and get pre-approved for this small business loan. And I had gotten married in my second year in Japan, to that romantic interest that had first brought me to Japan. And so I went through all of this process, and then I brought it to my wife and her family, and I said, okay, I want to expand the school. Here's what I've done. I've gotten pre-approved for all this stuff. Here's my plan. And they just said, no, in this family, we don't take on debt. And as a member of this family, you cannot.
Mm-hmm.
No, it's a wise and a very traditional approach, and there were reasons for that. In the past, the family had experienced severe trauma because of debt-related issues from certain members. So they just shut that down hard. So I thought, okay, well, I'm kind of demotivated in this business. I can't expand it anymore, and I'm burning out because I was working really long hours. Mm-hmm. So I was working like 8 a.m. to 9 p.m. Monday to Saturday. Yeah. And I was just getting tired. So I saw this opportunity to start a marketing agency, and one of my students at the time became quite a close friend, and he had some connections, in the local area. So we started this as co-founders. We started a marketing agency. And the initial idea was a full-service boutique agency creating everything from logo design and basic web pages, brochures, marketing. And we worked with local businesses. We worked with the local city in that area in Hokkaido. And we got some traction with a lot of interesting products. We promoted some ecologically friendly, sustainable products. A local wall plaster, for example, made from recycled scallop shells, which Hokkaido has a huge scallop shell industry. So kind of drew back on a little bit of that commercial fishing industry experience and understanding of how those supply chains worked and everything for that promotion. And we did find them distributors overseas and get them some traction with that, doing trade shows overseas and that kind of thing. And basic YouTube videos where I dressed as a traditional Japanese carpenter and, created this like viral series of YouTube videos. And this was in like 2007, I think. So it was pretty cutting edge at that time for like social media promotion. Anyway, that took off. And then it got this huge boost from the inbound tourism industry in Hokkaido. There were, a lot of people coming into the Hokkaido ski resort and a lot of investment going into it. Former English teachers and, Aussie ski bums started to see, oh, I could make a business out of this. And they'd go from ski schools to, real estate management companies, investment companies, and then real investment money was starting to come in via Hong Kong and Singapore and so on. So we started to build little local websites, and that scaled up into doing full end-to-end digital marketing campaigns for the Hilton Hotel, YTL Hotels, and like Niseko, Tourism Development Center, and so on. So we kind of shifted into focusing more on this inbound tourism industry, just because there was so much market demand there. And we grew to become, to my knowledge, we were the largest agency that focused on multilingual and multicultural end-to-end, digital marketing in all of northern Japan, to my knowledge. So we had, a team that was working on these various different campaigns and standardizing things more and more. One thing I've learned in my agency side experience in Japan, and we'll talk about this more, but I worked agency side for quite a bit longer after that for other agencies. It's very hard to make a go of it with just services in Japan. So the per hour consulting rate that a marketing agency can get or a digital consultant can get in Japan is considerably lower than the mean average globally. It's, for example, I think Japan's minimum wage sort of reflects that as well. I think amongst the OECD countries, Japan's 25, on par with Mexico for its average minimum wage, right? So that's a whole other series of issues that are caused from that. But essentially, for a services company, they just cannot bill enough. Time is not valued enough. And then clients demand such white glove, high level service that your per hour rate severely drops because you have to be responsive outside of regular business hours. If you work agency side, and this is true of even the largest like advertising agencies today, as reflected around some of the news that we've heard over the last few years about work-life balance at agencies like Dentsu. People are expected to be on call all the time, especially junior members. If you're an account manager, your client might call you up at midnight on a Sunday and ask you to jump, and you just say how high, right?
Right.
So because you're working so much overtime and so many long hours, your per hour rate drops to an unsustainable level. You simply cannot make money on services alone. So you have to supplement that with, like the large agencies do, with media placement. Or with a percentage commission on software sales or something like that. So we started to shift more and more into the digital sphere, where we would have reporting analytics software or conversion optimization software or something that identifies an issue with the client's website, and it allowed us to address that bundled with our services. So something like, here's an analytics tool. This is what this report means. It means that people are dropping off at this point in the website journey, and you need to address that. And here's some ideas for how we can do that. And so by bundling our services around the technology, we made that business model a little bit better, a little bit stronger. And we were able to scale that business for a couple more years. And then in 2010, I realized that, well, the ultimate sort of scalable business model was to drastically reduce the services and focus on our own software. And so I tried to shift gears into developing our own software product. Now, the thinking there is that, with software, you theoretically build it once and then you can sell it a million times, right? So it removes all these infrastructure and scalability issues and the need to hire, bilingual people or people with a certain skill set to support the software.
And to be on call 24/7.
And to be on call 24/7. Although, if you're selling software in Japan, you still have to be on call 24/7.
Well,
but
that.
It's to support, it's to support something that's already been built. And so the lift there should be considerably lighter. And so we looked at different ideas, and we realized that when we were building these websites for hotels and destination marketing organizations, it was the same architecture every time. The basic framework was the same. We were hosting it on a cloud server. Our head developer developed a script so that he could run that one time, and it would create a new install, essentially like a new box for a website with the correct architecture and all the functionality. And then our customer just had to input essentially their images and copyright their text, add their logo, and that would give them a personally branded destination site. And so that became what we called the Tourism Builder CMS or content management system for travel agencies. we developed and launched that with the assistance of some mentors, some local sort of angel investors. I went on a cross-country roadshow for about a year to try to raise capital to try and build up this idea, and we were diverting all of our marketing agency funds into building out this design and development team as well. And we were getting some traction, things were taking off. And then in March of 2011, of course, the big earthquake and resulting Fukushima fallout hit. And that really, of course, killed the tourism industry. So it killed both demand for our product and our one source of revenue, which had been more that marketing services side. But I refused to give up for a couple of years. I think it was about 18 months. I had been, I was still like early 30s. I think it was 33 or something. I had been successful with the school. I'd been pretty successful with the marketing agency. At one point, I took over from my co-founder as a CEO of that. And then I felt that we'd been pretty successful with the software company. Like I didn't know, especially not in Hokkaido at that time, I didn't know any other foreigners who'd built a business like this, which was designed to be, a scalable SaaS company where you could go through rounds of investment and theoretically scale the thing up. I'd done a great deal of study about how to perfect that formula for a SaaS company at a time when no information was available on funding or how you would meet an angel investor in Japan, or I just didn't have any real support network other than a few enterprising entrepreneurs in more traditional businesses like real estate and skiing.
Yeah, like the brick and mortar. And just for anyone listening who maybe needs a little bit of context, Japan is ranked amongst the highest in terms of countries where it's difficult to open a business. So there's an ease of business, that's places like New Zealand and Singapore, and Japan is almost flat last. And whatever you think might be difficult in Japan, if you want to imagine what it's like to do what Evan did in Hokkaido, just imagine that like on steroids. Like whatever difficulties you generally have in Japan, I can't even imagine what it's like in the North Island of Japan that sometimes seems a little bit isolated and a little bit disconnected from the networks and things like that. So just for a little bit of context.
Yeah, it was definitely, a steep learning curve. Let's put it that way. And ultimately, what happened with that tourism builder idea was that the decline in the tourism industry at that time killed it, but it killed it slowly because I was so sort of stubborn and
which is worse, isn't it? Worse when it dies slowly.
Well, it's worse when the founder or the manager is too sort of stubborn and not able to change. So it was a good learning for me because I'd been sort of a victim of my own success, small success, but up until that point, I just thought that I could power through. And there's this Japanese concept of gaman, just kind of buckle down, grit your teeth, fight through it.
Despite all odds,
Despite all that odds. And that is so highly respected in this culture that I was kind of encouraged to do that by my personal networks and advisors and so on as well. Just, buckle down and fight through it. And I did. And I used up, all of the investment money and then all the company's money and then all of my personal money. And at one point, my wife said, I can't take this anymore. And that relationship ended. And I woke up, one morning, basically in an empty office with a single desk and a desktop computer. And I'd slept under my desk because I no longer had, a house or anything.
Yeah.
And I thought, well, okay, this is rock bottom. Like I can't even, I don't even know how I'm going to eat this week.
Yeah.
And so I think I sold the desk. I brought the computer with me, and I had enough money for a plane ticket to Tokyo. Yeah. And I lined up like a few friends' sofas I could sleep on, or tatami, floors I could sleep on for a while. And it was a complete reset. There were a couple of nights where I was moving from one sofa to another and nothing was available. Luckily it was summer and I actually slept a night or two in a park using my big desktop computer in its box for a pillow. But you know, I got through that period. It was actually pretty quick. Only after 2 or 3 weeks, a CEO of Google Japan's largest solutions consulting partner, so a digital marketing agency that sold like that analytics software and packaged services around that for Google. He had seen me at some point down in Kyoto speaking on this roadshow where I was trying to raise funding for the tourism builder idea. So he saw me speaking about that and thought, okay, well, here's kind of a driven young foreigner who speaks Japanese. And by that time, I was doing pitches on stage in Japanese, so I was somewhat competent. And he thought, okay, this guy is sort of interesting. And so a mutual friend kind of said, well, why don't you go work there? This company was called E-Agency. And the CEO and their board of directors had a meeting with me, and they said, well, we don't really know what you're going to do, but we'll find something for you, so come on board. And I joined the marketing team. And it was, the first week or so was looking into maybe they should have an English website to promote their services and this kind of thing. But about, I think it was day 10, I saw this email from a tech partner that was a tech vendor that was looking to enter the Japanese market. And I knew of the technology. I knew that they were in a good space and that they probably had an opportunity to expand in Japan. So I asked around internally, what's this email about? They said they were coming to Japan to do their first sort of roadshow and visit partners. And I said, are we a partner? They said, well, we met them at a trade show in San Diego or somewhere. And
once,
we thought that, once, like the partnership had sort of been explored. And I think there was actually an agreement in place, but it wasn't very active at that time. So I thought, oh, this is a great opportunity. So I met the team at Haneda Airport when they flew in from San Francisco. And then I just did my best to show them around Tokyo and kind of help them understand the lay of the land, the market here and everything for about a week. And that developed into a very, very strong relationship. We became their primary. Yeah, it was serendipitous. So we were able to get them started with their partnerships, both the E-Agency where I'd been working and a few other agencies. I was able to, kind of advise one of those team members who became a great personal friend, and the country manager initially for this technology. It was the Optimizely A/B testing, which is quite actually similar to what I do now as country manager of Dynamic Yield. But as this partner able to help them enter the market, I got firsthand experience about how to build out the office here, how they went about incorporating here and hiring and building out their team, and then how we built out the channel partner side of their business to get that initial sort of sales pump, or prime the pump to get the sales engine running. I mean, this is common when entering the Japanese market, especially for a tech company. It's very difficult to enter the market and directly go to building your own sales team and selling direct to the market. Oracle kind of templated this playbook, and then Salesforce and Marketo, many other companies have followed it to good success. You kind of get the initial sales flow going with channel partners for the first year or so, and then as that engine ramps up, then you learn how to do the direct component. Anyway, I worked agency side and I helped them, sold other technology at the same time, and got more and more into the technology side of this marketing sphere. So it was really the MarTech, big data, getting into understanding how to process large data sets and draw actionable insights from that, and then advise clients on how that should inform their campaigns. Other agencies started to reach out to us, so a little bit from the advertising side. So I started to do some more consulting, and I had built a sales team within E-Agency, to sell and service the Optimizely product. And that reached sort of a point of completion. And then I started to step away from that more, partly because I was getting these requests for consulting, and partly because I felt that I had this idea for the formula about how to help companies enter the Japanese market. And I wanted to really test and build out this formula more. And then also because I was then at a point, and the market was at a point where I could focus back on my own projects a little bit. So I slowly scaled down my time at E-Agency, increased my time in this market entry consulting, data consulting, business development in Japan. And I also focused on the tourism builder concept. We still had all the source code. We still had, everything to rebuild that. And although our lead developer had gone back to the States, him and I were able to rebuild that on a part-time basis. And we actually got that to the point where we sold the software, to Okinawa Prefecture, Shizuoka Prefecture, a couple of locations around Japan and Hokkaido. So it started to get a little bit of traction. But as that market took off, this sort of packaged destination marketing organization, or DMO, or travel industry type of CMS, more and more players started to step into it. So like Squarespace launched all of their travel related templates, and then Wix really took off in the Japanese market. So at some point, I looked around and I saw that every day I was getting retargeted with these YouTube ads selling this competing software at a price point that we couldn't really compete with. And then they had like Super Bowl ad campaigns going and stuff. So I thought, well, maybe we'll have to concede this space because it's not really a growth opportunity anymore.
That's also learning, right? You, compared to last time, that you were able to say, okay, this is a learning experience. I'm going to see this ball come in. Let's pivot now. Yeah.
So, that there's still some interesting things I'd like to revisit at some point and explore in the tourism space and what we were doing with that software. But, when I do revisit that, it would be more as a mentor and advisor, possibly as an investor in companies that explore that based on sort of the initial groundwork that we did. And it won't be happening during the COVID-19 crisis, right? It's not a good time to be in tourism and travel. But I took all these sort of parts that I had and I packaged them together into what essentially became market entry consulting. So I helped as an independent, business development and market entry consultant. I helped a series of tech companies explore the Japanese market, and we'd usually do a 6-month cycle. After which they determined whether there was enough traction to start building out a team and hire me as the official representative and so on. So after I think it was about 18 months of doing these cycles, my current company, Dynamic Yield, saw that we were able to get enough traction. We had enough of that initial channel partner ecosystem built out that in January of this year, they hired me as the full-time country manager to keep building out this team. So now I'm at the point where I'm doing my best to perfect that formula that I'd felt I'd seen and gotten a little bit of the inner workings of, but hadn't really built out to full scale. So our goal here is to really build out this market, build out both the channel partners and eventually a direct sales and service model, and see how far we can take that within the Japanese market. So that pretty much brings us up to date to where I am now. So there you go. There's my career, pretty much my entire working career.
No, thank you so much for sharing. And one of the reasons why it's so important is because there's these stories that exist in Japan about foreigners that have, built businesses in, I would say, non-traditional ways. They've seen things, they've learned things. And this podcast is really such an opportunity to showcase people like you that have had, that have had such an interesting journey. And you and I connected because, I found this so interesting is that your life really has been, or, what we've learned of this kind of like past, your working life in Japan has been very much this, how do we create, an excellent digital customer experience? And this has been so much, the driving force. But then we kind of started, unpacking the conversation. We recognized that it's not as easy to, to turn the key as we've seen. For example, you mentioned on that you mentioned a graph that we've had 10 years of growth in the last 90 days. So
the McKinsey report, yeah. So
exactly.
That was for e-commerce. In the past 90 days, the American e-commerce market went through the projected trajectory, and the projected trajectory, the next 10 years of growth and adoption of e-commerce suddenly spiked, and in 90 days they jumped ahead 10 years. Japan is seeing a similar spike, but not at the same level. And that's probably a good segue into that part of the conversation where we can talk about what's going on right now, topically,
Yeah.
what's going on with this whole coronavirus issue, how Japan is responding to it, and where we see it going in the future.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's interesting. I'd love to hear your perspective, not only as, a consumer in Japan, but as also, as a business leader, you're managing a team, you're managing a brand, you're managing a business. So why don't you walk us through kind of why there's that gap, where there's that lag? Because, there's this idea that digital is, democracy. So, there shouldn't be these issues in Japan. Really, if you have an internet connection, then we should be good to go, but that's really not the case. So why don't you kind of paint that picture for us about what's going on?
Yeah, and it's interesting the way you phrase that, because I saw it as an opportunity when I was a small business owner trying to look at ways to build a more scalable, sustainable, more profitable business. I thought, well, the internet removes so much of the need for infrastructure and gives so much opportunity that it does really democratize certainly what I could do as a small business owner here in Japan, and certainly as as a foreigner, with a person with fewer connections than the average entrepreneur would have. So for me, it was something that I adopted wholeheartedly. But there are a lot of both cultural and I think technical reasons why that is still difficult for some people. And let's frame this through my current area of expertise, which is e-commerce, because my industry right now is what we are sort of coming to call a COVID beneficiary.
Mm-hmm.
Obviously, in a time when so many people are suffering, we don't want to sort of harp on the fact that it can be a boon to business, but the simple reality is that there's an industry shift going on. And while a lot of the companies we work with are retail fashion brands that are having to downsize their workforces in the brick and mortar side, there's actually an opportunity as well, because they're able to move some of those staff over to the e-commerce side. E-commerce has spiked in Japan. Even as recently as 2019, Japan was a large e-commerce market. It was the fourth largest e-commerce market in the world. But adoption of e-commerce was actually very low. I forget the exact statistics. It was something like, I think overall e-commerce across the majority of brands, population's adoption of e-commerce was like 30% or something like that, mm-hmm. Which kind of stands to reason, because if you look at, demographically, what is Japan? Japan is a nation where 75% of the population are over age 65. Or sorry, 1/3 of the population is over 65, and the median age, I think, is 55. So when it comes to adopting new technology, especially digital technology, Japan as a nation is not a nation of digital natives. People did not grow up with this technology.
That's right.
They were not in their early formative years when internet became commonplace, like it was for us. And I'm lucky. I'm I guess Generation X, right? I was born in the 70s, and so.
But you're a learner, right? So that's different. There are people that just learn or not. And I also read a statistic that the most internet fluent person is a South Korean girl, like in like a teenage girl, as in internet fluency and like comfortable like buying on the internet and things like that is a South Korean girl. And they're neighbors, and yet we have this huge gap.
Yeah, I think there are a few reasons for that. Part of it is interest. I think culturally right now, Japan has gone through this period of having a large baby boom. Obviously, huge. If you look at the 60s and 70s, youth culture in Japan was extremely strong. I think just anecdotally speaking, I don't have data on this, but I would say I haven't seen a really strong youth culture since about the late 90s in Japan. I think around the time that I arrived in Japan, youth culture was losing its power, and middle age and beyond culture was rising in terms of cultural impact. So, I think because there's such a small young population the young generation, essentially millennials in Japan, are such a small part of the population. They just don't feel this sort of energy and optimism and ability to go out and do things. If you look at, for example, the percentage of young people who are traveling overseas in Japan or studying abroad, for example, it's drastically declined since the 90s. And the young generation is adopting, yes, the young generation is adopting a much more insular, sort of almost closed mentality, much less interest in foreign travel, foreign brands, and foreign culture. And more interest in sort of niche, domestic cultural pursuits. And that's just what it is. That's the way the culture goes. It goes through cycles where, interest in looking externally and interest in looking internally goes through natural cycles. I think we're seeing globally the fall of globalism and return to a more, somewhat driven by populism, but just somewhat driven by a natural sort of pendulum swing. We were all on board with this sort of utopian concept of globalism bringing us all together. And then we realized that let's not move too fast. There are some reasons why maybe we can't all get along so smoothly when towers start falling and that sort of thing. We realize the negative aspects of moving too quickly there. So there's a natural sort of, I think, retracting and inward looking is happening internationally, but Japan is especially representative of that. I think South Korea is, although they also have an aging population, I think they're just at a cultural point where they are looking externally. They're more interested in being a more active member of the global society. I think the internet is a part of that. People are really interested in connecting more online. You see these, sort of massive tribes of people interacting online, following K-pop stars and that sort of thing, and creating their own almost like ecosystems. Now, there is that to a certain extent in Japan, but population-wise, the percentage is considerably lower, almost shockingly lower. And then there's a few things like, South Korea has the fastest internet in the world at that final, last mile where you're connecting to the individual user. But I think that there's also a higher saturation of personal computers. Japan actually doesn't have that many personal computers in comparison. I think the US is at 89 or 90% of households actually have a desktop or a notebook computer. In Japan, as of 2019, it was like 75%. So in many ways, Japan kind of skipped over using computers, or actually tired of using computers is a better way to say that, because over the past 10 years, personal computer ownership has declined something like 13 or 15%, somewhere around there. So it's gone more to mobile devices. So people are doing all their computing, all of the personal things they need to do on a mobile phone. But I think it highlights why it's very difficult for Japan to shift into this new digital economy. People didn't really trust mobile phones that much, so that, again, median age 55, people were not so comfortable shopping on their phones. But over the past 3 months or so, during the sort of self-imposed lockdown, or requested stay-at-home order and so on, people have been shopping a lot more. And so even that older demographic has moved into grocery shopping, purchasing things on Rakuten and Amazon and so on. So there is an increasing adoption. I think it's being led primarily on mobile because there aren't as many notebooks and desktop computers. So we're seeing that shift start to be forced now. A lot of things are being forced by this coronavirus shift. But for Japan Inc., for Japanese corporations, that's a very difficult time period. The Japanese government has asked corporations to have up to 70% of their workforce working from home. During the first enforced lockdown, I think that was up to 60% or something, but then it went down. I think currently it's only about 20% of workforces are actually teleworking or working remotely. What's more common is that they're working in shifts. So a lot of the large corporations that I work with, they're just having a shift where they're sometimes in the office and sometimes from home. And I'm kind of following that myself. I'm in the office today, but tomorrow I might work from home depending on the meetings that I have. So we have a little bit more flexibility there, but we have this issue of because people don't have these sort of home offices. Obviously, Japanese apartments are too small. Most people don't have an actual home office. It's been really hard during summer vacation when kids are home from school and interrupting the workflows. A lot of people don't have their actual personal computer, or they're not allowed to use their personal computer for work, so they have to bring home a company computer. They may not have wired internet at home. They're most likely connecting via their tethered mobile phone or like a pocket Wi-Fi device or something like that. So there are basic like infrastructure considerations. And then even when you're using a company computer, I think you highlighted this point, most in-office, even notebook computers, they're built to plug in to the office wall socket, which probably has a three-prong connector, right? It's got the ground, the three plugs, right? Whereas a lot of outlets at home only have the two prongs. So you physically cannot plug in your work computer at home. And so there's been a run on these adapters for like from the 100 yen stores so that people can actually plug in their work computers at home. And then those work computers, they're usually very strong, safe, secure computers, but they're not designed for like multimedia. So they're not web camera enabled.
Yes.
So people have to go out and buy external USB cameras.
But they're sold out.
And they're sold out. So there's a backlog on that. And then there's been just a steep learning curve to learning, like we're talking on Zoom right now, which it has been, obviously a great assist through this whole working from home shift. I wish I'd taken my friend's advice and bought stock in Zoom last year.
Oh no!
But kind of missed the boat on that one. But there's a real learning curve to this technology, and for the average user, it's hard. Even for tech savvy people, it's hard. We're currently expanding our team, and I'm interviewing Japanese solutions engineers right now. Over the course of the past few weeks, I've conducted multiple interviews, many of which have been done in a home environment on a mobile phone using Zoom, because their computer isn't capable of handling the call. And a couple of calls
or they
where
just don't have one.
They just don't have one. A couple of calls where the person wasn't able to get their phone to connect correctly, and they had to take the call, on their notebook computer, but then there wasn't a web camera, so I never saw their face. And it's hard to interview under the circumstance. And these are engineers. These are people who should be able to figure out this technology, and in theory have had some time to do so, but there are still issues where people aren't able to do that yet. So that is it's sort of this interesting ecosystem where the whole coronavirus thing has been this massive lever to move Japan into the digital age. There's huge demand. E-commerce is taking off. There's multiple business opportunities in e-commerce. Even the sort of older population is moving into e-commerce. Many corporations are moving into wanting to do remote work and telework, but they're not able to do that yet. And it's probably going to be something like another 18 months before all of these little infrastructure things, these little series of processes can start moving. Now, Japan is great when it gets its processes in line. It's like the train system. I think in 18 months, all these little issues will be worked out, and we'll start to see the trains, the metaphorical trains running smoothly again in terms of business processes. But right now, everything's jammed. And so nothing is moving. All traditional business processes are slowed down. A big part of that is simple infrastructure. The Japanese government needs to change a lot of legislation to make this shift into the digital world. The Japanese government has something like 55,000 different processes that are necessary to function, and 7% of those can currently be done digitally. And this is, I only have anecdotal data to back this up, but my personal hypothesis is that Japan has been adverse to moving to the digital world because it's a country that experiences so many natural disasters, because of the earthquakes and the floods and tsunamis and typhoons, and just there's something that's going to come and shake everything up constantly. Every few months, something happens. I think Japan has been very reluctant to move away from the traditional analog processes because the digital world is just not trusted. They believe that it's too easy to hack digital information, or that the server center is just going to get destroyed in an earthquake and they're going to lose everything. And so there's basic legislation. For example, the tax office requires a paper copy. The Genpon, the original copy of all contracts, all purchase orders and everything. It has to be kept, depending on the type of contract, up to 7 years. There must be a physical paper copy of that kept. All of those processes need to move into a more streamlined digital ecosystem. But then the different offices within the bureaucracy need to be able to communicate to each other. And the only way to do that would be through the digitized My Number system. And Japan has been very adverse to moving to a digitized My Number system. And for reference for listeners, that's like a social insurance number, right? As a Canadian citizen, I had one when I was 15 and I first started working. I had a SIN card, a SIN number. So Japan still doesn't have a standardized system. The My Number system was introduced in an analog version a couple of years ago, but it wasn't widely adopted. It's not very well reinforced. Most contracts, most processes are still, you literally register your stamp, and then you stamp this like red ink stamp on documents, and you have a digitized version of that stamp that you can register if you want to be able to use that for business, for making contracts and so on. An inkan shomeisho, right? I don't know how you'd say that in English.
Like
a notarized version of your
notarized
stamp.
copy, like a certified copy.
Yeah. So and I have mine with me at all times. In this bag, in its special compartment, is my personal inkan, and then my company inkan, and I have to have those ready in case I have to stamp some document at some time. So we need to have legislation put in place to remove those bottlenecks, essentially, to a digitized workflow. The practical implication of it is that right now employees are supposed to be able to work from home. And the reality is that anybody at the mid-manager level and above actually has to go into the office at least once or twice a week to literally stamp all of these documents. Things like a purchase order, for example, has to go through what's called the Lingisho process. And that's a process where every stakeholder in any decision in a Japanese corporation, there has to be a written sort of proposal about what's going to happen, or there has to be a purchase order or something like that. It has to be printed out in a hard copy, and then it's often faxed from office to office, and every manager has to literally stamp off on it. They have to stamp and often initial, and then they put it on the desk of the next person. Well, I might stamp and then put it on the desk of Tanaka-san, but if Tanaka-san's remote working and he's not in until 4 days later, that entire purchase order process is delayed until he can come in and stamp it and then put it on the desk of the next person.
Despite how significant he is to the process, right? Which is also interesting. Like maybe he's really not, his opinion is really, zero, yet he's a stakeholder for whatever political reason. And this is being held up for exactly this reason.
Yeah, and that's a cultural issue. Some of it is mid-60s work reform to have better representation at the ground level by the unions, and a more socialist working style that probably was necessary when those reforms came. Some of it is just the nature of doing work in Japan, that everything is consensus based, that you have stakeholder alignment. First, because the ultimate goal of the corporation is to contribute to society in a harmonious manner, in keeping with Confucian ethics, that harmony is the greatest truth there is, and so harmony is reality. And by doing that whole Ringisho process, where you get all your stakeholders in alignment and physically signing off on it, there is no disharmony, there is no dissenting voice. If there is, it holds up the process, and it can hold up the process for weeks, months, or years, but that's fine because the ultimate goal is not necessarily doing business, but it's doing business harmoniously. So there are cultural reasons why these processes exist. The positive to that is that it's often said, like a North American or European corporation, when they implement something new, they tend to do about 20% planning and then 80% just working it out on the fly. And they're structured to be able to innovate and troubleshoot on the fly. Whereas a Japanese corporation does about 80% pre-planning and then about 20% execution, and nothing can be reworked on the fly, but it's already been planned out. So the overall timeline is much more harmonious in a Japanese corporation, even if it's longer. Once you've done all your planning and stakeholder alignment and everything, then you can execute things pretty quickly. So there's pluses and minuses to both. And then we have simple economic factors. Like in Japan, this is probably not a widely known fact, but out of, what is it? I forget exactly the figure. There's something like, I don't know, it's like 36 million companies in Japan, right? And 30 million of those have an average employee count of 3.4 people, something like that. I'd have to check the figures. But out of all of the OECD companies, Japan is by far just off the spectrum in terms of these tiny, tiny companies. Within the agency model, for example, you have your big three silos. You've got your Dentsu, Hakuhodo, and Asatsu DK, and recent news has focused on things like there was a government initiative to facilitate, I think, some subsidies and handouts to small business. And it was managed by a subsidiary of Dentsu. And then it turned out that they'd subcontracted that to a subcontractor who'd subcontracted that to a subcontractor. But that's the norm. Every process in Japan goes into one of these funnels where within the silo, there's subcontractors and subcontractors and subcontractors, and it gets down to these 2 and 3 people companies. It's one way that Japan manages to keep the unemployment rate so low. Because people are gainfully employed, they're off the streets, and it's one reason why Japan is so safe. People are kept busy, and so they're not.
Don't have time to make trouble. Yeah.
They don't have time to make trouble, and that was by intention. Going back to the post-war period, it was let's keep people out of gangs by sort of keeping them busy and promoting, mostly through tax incentives, these tiny little companies that can employ people across a wide range of industries. Even like this holds true for all Japanese corporations. Even at Toyota, you have the manufacturers for certain parts that subcontract to the manufacturers.
Yes.
They'll have like a single little rubber seal or something that they build, but then they have to subcontract to all.
But the glue is from somebody else, and then the whatever is from somebody else. And I think this gets back to, and it gives the listeners a really great perspective into why harmonious business is so important, is because often you pass the product down the line so far that you don't even know where it is. So you the only thing that really you have is the trust that the person who passed it on to the next person trusts that person. So this is a little bit why that trust is not simply an esoteric word in Japan. It's very much the basis of how people operate.
Yes, and it really reinforces why those processes of creating a harmonious work environment are so important. And again, it's by design. The government has created this situation so that it's pretty easy to get into business in Japan, like we were talking about earlier, especially for a native Japanese. It's very easy. You can start a company. You and I could start a company tomorrow. We could have it registered in a couple of weeks, and we wouldn't even need a business license for most activities apart from like restaurant and hospitality industry. All we have to do is submit a report to the tax office next year, and then essentially we're up and running. It's really easy. And it does spark entrepreneurship to a certain extent within some industries, but it tends to be more relationship-based subcontractor and more sort of brick and mortar type industries. But then having all of that complexity means that there's no economies of scale, and there's no power when it comes to needing to make a shift. Like right now, if you went to those millions and millions of 3 to 5 person companies and said, okay, everybody has to telework now, and so you all have to work from home, they're going to say, great, give me a computer,
Yeah.
and teach me how to use it.
Mm-hmm.
Well, you don't have the purchasing power in a 5 person company to just go out and buy 5 computers for all your employees and then teach them how to use Zoom. You might, if there was consolidation and it was a 300 person company and there was an IT department that could manage the security and deal with
Yeah, we
the
were working with minimal infrastructure. We had at least some kind of infrastructure. Yeah.
So like at the individual level, maybe you could say, okay, here's a little extra bonus this month. Go work out the computer situation and train yourself how to use Google Meet or something like that. And I think that's what a lot of companies are having to do, is just encouraging their employees to work it out for themselves.
Mm-hmm.
But there just isn't even the mid to semi-large corporation that can purchase all of the necessary units and create the necessary infrastructure so that people can telework and shift more to this digital work structure. And then, because there aren't these IT departments that can support them in their cybersecurity needs, Japan is actually extremely vulnerable. Amongst the developed countries, it is probably the most vulnerable to hacking and cybersecurity breaches right now. As we've seen in the news in the past few weeks, there have been some major, like Mitsubishi had an employee who very innocently opened the wrong type of file, infected his work computer. He plugged it into his workstation when he was in the office, and then it infected an entire department. I think it was like 300 computers or something compromised by this virus. So all of this points to the growing pains that Japan is going through right now. In many ways, it's a bit of a generational issue, in that this large median 55-year-old workforce, many of whom only have about 10 years left that they were planning to work, aren't very comfortable with investing the next 10 years and figuring out how to relearn all their work processes just so that they can get through to retirement. It's a lot easier for them to kind of coast on what's worked so far. And that has become the attitude, I think, of most Japanese corporations, because Japan, more than any other developed nation, has corporations that are sitting on massive war chests of cash.
Right.
Since the bubble period, every business that had a functioning business model stopped reinvesting that in anything risky and just kind of sat on it. And so Japan is actually really well positioned, even though there's all these small companies and very sort of mid-tier companies. The large corporations, and I would assume the mid-tier companies as well, I don't have actual data on it, but it's just my anecdotal impression. They have these huge reserves of cash that they're able to sit on and just sort of ride out this whole pandemic thing. So the pandemic
adding
itself,
to that, which is not only not anecdotal data, but actual data, 52% of companies over 100 years old are Japanese companies. So if we think about any company that's over 100 years old in the world, 52% of them are in Japan. So this point that you bring up of, well, do I bother changing now? And for me, this is an absolute, you just open Pandora's box, because this is one thing that I believe is that one of the real stoppers to that digital shift, because once Japan does shift, they're really like a rocket ship. One of the stoppers is really that, well, I only really have 10 years to go. And do I want, and I've built this legacy, and do I really want the last 10 years of my career, where I should be doing that kind of real legacy work and that kind of, positioning myself to go into the government and things like that. Do I want to be doing that, trying to working out, how to work digitally? This is not kind of what was in their plan. And so I see quite a lot of, I would call it older middle-aged, that kind of, I have 5 to 8 years left to retirement personality, that they're kind of thinking this, well, let's just see if this is just like a summer vacation model. And, and this is actually something that, that you said this is not summer vacation.
When we talked earlier, I was mentioning that, you know, when it first came in, the whole need to telework and you know, not go into the office and everything, I think most companies looked at that and said, okay, well, you know, we're almost into spring break, so we'll just kind of treat this as an extended holiday, and we'll kind of furlough some people, let them work from home, and it'll go away. And it didn't go away, and extended into
Mhm.
summer. And I think a lot of corporations are still kind of saying, okay, well, we're just going to take, it's going to be a slow year. We'll consider this an extended spring and summer vacation, and we'll get back to work, you know, maybe in the fall or next year.
Right, which gets back
But
to your point of the war chest, right? This is where the cash is, and what we've actually seen, and I have when we spoke to Josh Flannery from the or who runs Rainmaking Loft, which works essentially with a lot of keiretsu companies in Osaka in Kansai, that the companies that are investing in startups are not angel investors. They're very old traditional Japanese companies that have like these back rooms full of cash, and then they use this cash to then go and invest in companies. But actually you could very much repurpose you know, this cash flow within the organization, because they do have these stacks for rainy days. And in Japan, a rainy day like coronavirus can be a year and it's not really a big problem.
yeah, and that's interesting. It really does highlight the like the venture capital and investment world in Japan. These companies normally probably would invest in internal ventures. However, none of their management would take that on
Mm-hmm.
because and this sort of speaks not just to those who have 10 years left in their career, but those like myself who probably have around 20 years left in their working career. If I were a mid-level manager at a Japanese corporation, my desire right now would probably be to advance in my career and move up to senior management. The only way to do that in a Japanese corporation would be not to make any mistakes.
Correct.
So, because it's actually interesting how powerful the HR department is in Japanese corporations. There's an argument that could be made that they actually run the entire show, because when you start in a Japanese company, you're hired. If it's a large company, you're hired with a large cohort of your fellow graduates in the spring, and you all start out with basically like 100 points, and
Mm-hmm.
that's got to last you for your entire career, because 100, basically 100%, you know, 100 I think, 100 points, right? That's all you can ever get in your career. You can never
Mm-hmm.
get above that. And no matter what you do, you can't build it back up again. You can only lose points. So
Right.
as a manager, as an employee, and as a manager, every time you take a risk and make a mistake, HR puts like a little black mark next to your name and you lose some points. Every time, you know, your whole division doesn't do so well, you lose points. So the game is basically start with 100 and maintain harmony through your entire career so you don't lose too many points. And those who've been, you know, the least risky, by the time they get to their 40s and 50s, they're candidates for promotion.
Mhm.
So do nothing and you will get promoted.
Right, which is
Now,
almost, which is totally counterintuitive to anything that if you've been if you work or if you're educated in the West, it's the opposite.
it's counterintuitive to, yeah, the system in the West where you start with 0 and you try to build up to 100. And if you get to
Right.
100, then you get to be CEO of the corporation or
Mm-hmm.
chairman or whatever. Right? So you start with nothing and you build up, and you do that through essentially navigating the meritocracy, where those who are the most productive, the most efficient, the most innovative, the hardest working, they actually advance.
Mm-hmm.
And within a Japanese company, because you have to start with 100 and not lose your points, it's more, it's equally intense, but it's a
Mm-hmm.
war with your coworkers. Like, oh, you know, Suzuki worked an extra hour of overtime, and I didn't. I might lose a point. I got to
Overnight
work
show.
this
Yeah.
weekend, right? So it's this battle amongst your cohort, and they slowly drop off. You start with whatever 300 in your cohort when you're hired at a big company, and they drop off. And if you can maintain your position, then you win. It's like Survivor, right? The TV show where they kick people off the desert island and give them different challenges and stuff.
Yeah,
So
exactly.
you know, your career in Japan is basically like that. survivor if you want to be at upper management. And a lot of people don't. And so they find a comfortable position where
And
they
stay
don't
there.
make any waves and they're not particularly challenged, and maybe they're good at one thing. But there's never really that pressure to increase their productivity, because upper management isn't saying, I want to get promoted, so my team has to be more productive. It's more, I want to get promoted, so my team has to do exactly what they are right now and not make any waves. Right?
Correct.
Now,
So where does
that's
that leave us
why,
now, right? This is like, where does that
well,
leave us now?
that's the point. That's where the interesting opportunity lies. If you are entrepreneurially minded, you could start a startup company,
Mm-hmm.
and then one of these large companies will say, well, none of our managers can take a risk doing anything innovative, but we can acquire this company and they can
Outsource the
take on
risk.
all the risk. Yeah. And that's why there's this outsourcing ecosystem, right? Because if we outsource all the risk, then if something goes wrong, we can yell at the people in the subsidiary, but
Or
we
just
didn't do
cut them off and never say anything and pretend like it never happened is another way we can also
it.
deal with it.
Yes, exactly.
What are some other
Well, yeah,
opportunities? So we say, okay, for entrepreneurial minded people, now's the time for Japan, because this is when you can come and knock on the door and say, hey, anything new that you want to do, put it under our name and we'll sign for the risk. What are the other
anybody,
things?
yeah, exactly. Anybody who is willing to take on a certain amount of risk. And because
Mm-hmm.
the threshold for risk tolerance in Japan is so low,
Yeah.
it means that there's just a plethora of opportunities for anybody who can take on a little bit of risk. Now, obviously you want to structure that intelligently, but it's
Mm-hmm.
actually much less risk than is required in a competitive environments like Silicon Valley or Tel Aviv, where my company is from. If you can simply create a functioning team that's creating, removing a pain point or creating a good functioning solution, it's quite easy to get acquired by a larger corporation
Mm-hmm.
to take on that risk for them. And eventually you might even fully absorb into that other corporation because you've proven that, that you're pretty steady. So, with this whole shift that's going on right now, this spring, for the first time ever, the entire cohort of new graduates didn't go into that established 60-year-old recruitment system. They're staggered out for the first time ever. And this generation has the first chance in Japan's modern history to craft new career paths. So I would highly encourage this cohort of 20-year-olds or whatever, however old they are right now.
Yeah, about that.
24-year-olds, I guess, to look at forming startup companies, to look at the huge opportunities with the incredible uptick in digital adoption. There's a massive need for like cybersecurity startups. There's
Mm-hmm.
a massive need for basic infrastructure. There's no reason why there couldn't be a Japanese version of Zoom that improves on the interface more for local language support. There should be a better alternative to Slack for the Japanese market, because there are ways of doing work that I think can be improved on with that. There are so many opportunities, not just for like the Japanese version of this or that,
Mm-hmm.
but there are also opportunities for Japanese companies to create solutions for this market, which can be scaled up globally. That's not a well-trodden path. We don't see many companies started in Japan that can go global. There are a lot of cultural hurdles to overcome there, but
Mm-hmm.
I think if you can find and address a pain point that's fairly universal, then you can bring that solution to other markets. But I would highly focus, this generation of entrepreneurs to focus on the infrastructure light and probably more tech-heavy cloud-based solutions, and to really grasp intangibles. That one of Japan's greatest strengths throughout the entire industrial age was the craftsmanship that had been developed for millennia. Sword making and pottery and art and all of these, the ability to take anything and make it smaller and smaller and smaller, miniaturization. All of these traditional sort of craftsmanship led approaches to manufacturing resulted in the Toyotas and the early electronics, the Sony Walkman and all these innovations, because Japan was so good at crafting these processes to make things better. But unfortunately, Japan, that's its great strength, but its weakness is that the Japan Inc. does not get intangibles. And software cannot be crafted the same way that a craftsman creates a perfect sword. Software is an intangible. It's hard to wrap your head around it. A lot of different people are probably working on different patches of the code here and there and different parts of it. So you can never really visualize the thing. You can't like touch and feel it and understand it completely. And it's never perfect because you have to constantly patch it and keep updating it. So I think it is just fundamentally a sort of a disharmonious, disruptive area to work in that is antithetical to the harmonious-based workflow in Japan and this sort of Confucian-based, concept of reality. So it's a stretch, but if Japanese startups can start to wrap their heads around the intangibles of coding a little bit better and get more comfortable with launching products that are not quite perfect, and also if the market can just be a little bit more forgiving, if this need for white glove service can be focused a little bit more. Yeah, I mean, we shouldn't lose that because Japan has the best services sector in the world because of that culture. We don't want to lose that, but we want to find a way to shift so that maybe it's not going to be perfect all the time, but we can respond very quickly and very efficiently.
Right, but we're working towards that, right?
Yeah. So maybe to use like a manufacturing analogy, it would be like, okay, so until now the car has been almost perfect and it would run for 10 years with almost no maintenance whatsoever. Now we have to work in this model where, the car might get a flat tire every month or two, but we're going to have a team like following behind you to change it in 5 minutes. So it's not a huge, sort of this like mental shift about what is realistic expectations on the customer standpoint. If the customers can kind of wrap their heads a little bit more around the needs of the digital world and this need to be to move much quicker and sort of be more responsive to issues rather than perfecting the issues beforehand, then I think Japan can navigate this shift into the digital world much better.
I love that, and I think that's the perfect moment to then leave the listeners with one last thought and one last question, which is what's next for you? Obviously, you're in a very unique position. You're leading a company that's kind of on the winning side of the coronavirus. What's next for you?
Well, I've learned a lot. It's been almost 20 years in Japan, and I've learned a great deal during that period. Sure. But I can't always apply everything I learned. So I'd like for somebody to be learning from all of these mistakes that I've made, if not myself. So I'm trying to move more into like mentoring and advising. I got some huge help when I was trying to build my first software startup from what we would now call an angel investment, seed investment community. And I think the next 10 years of my career will be moving more into part-time board positions, advisorships, possibly if I see fit, maybe making some of these seed stage investments, trying to help Japan's startups to solve these problems and do them in a scalable manner, whether that's for that local acquisition path or a global expansion path. I'd really like to try and help shed some light on how that can be accomplished. I think the foreigners and the startups, the ecosystem that grew up in Japan since around 2005 or so, we're starting to see some pretty big exits. We're starting to see what's really necessary for a healthy startup environments. Like the Silicon Valley model, right, is not based on easy access to capital. It's actually based on easy access to knowledge and mentorship. Going back to the days of Hewlett Packard and the early like garage startups, you had engineers and business people who were figuring out how to build and scale companies. And then they were exiting from those companies at a young enough age that they still were very active in the community and they were giving back. So it's mentorship, right? So, like the, what was it? The hacker, I can't remember where like Wozniak and Steve Jobs first met. There was some hacker group, and I think Bill Gates was a member of that at some point. The Homebrew Computer Club, that's what I'm thinking of. So in Japan, we're starting to see this where successful entrepreneurs are exiting and then they're giving back to the community. Even within my cohort of, like gaijin entrepreneurs who were trying to build businesses in the early 2000s, mid 2000s, there have been some very successful exits. We're starting to see people like, Jay Winder, for example, at Make Leaps, acquired by one of these large corporations recently. If I thought about it for a while, I can come up with about 10 good success stories. Zozo Town, I think, has been a really interesting acquisition by Yahoo for like, I think the stake that they purchased was something like 3 or 4 billion. So Maezawa-san was able to exit, still advise, but move on to other projects. So yeah, we're seeing that that ecosystem come to fruition, and I would love to be a part of that moving forward in my career.
Well, I think it's at this point, I'll certainly include all of your contact details, but if anyone's listening, Evan also speaks fluent Japanese, so he can support you either in English or in Japanese. So Evan, we've just been we've been so lucky to have so much of your time and for you to have so thoughtfully and succinctly and intelligently, but also with an incredible depth of empathy, synthesize the learnings and even draw. There's that quote that you can't predict the future. You can only draw the connections looking back. And I think this is so much what we've just had is that we've just had someone that's just such has done so much in the digital world, and that you've simply just been able to layer that that knowledge into this kind of coronavirus time. And I think this has been such an incredible even learning experience for me. So I'd like to thank you so much for your time, and please come back on the Business Karaoke podcast anytime, because I have about 1,000 more questions that I would like to ask you.
Well, thanks very much, Brittany. I really appreciate what you're doing for the community with this platform. Thanks for giving voice to some of the lessons that I've learned. And I do encourage anybody to contact me through my LinkedIn profile or Facebook or whatever. If we can give a little bit back after having been given so much by our predecessors and our mentors, and I think that's a great thing to be able to keep that flywheel going. So thanks again. Appreciate the time, and I hope you can trim this down to something short enough that people will listen to.